worry, whatever you see is not the same as necessarily as what we see.
All right, all right.
I think we can all see you.
Well, that's fine. That's all I needed to, well, yeah. Okay. Well, the picture that was in your publicity showed Roger in a wheelchair and bald. And that was in fact taken at the Hungarian embassy that I'll come back in December last year, which I'll just come back to in a minute. However, to give a slightly different impression, I will show you a picture. Can everybody see that?
Hey.
Of Roger and me 40 years ago at Adam Smith's tomb in Edinburgh. So that reminds us of an earlier time. And yeah, no, they can see it. Yeah.
Roger's on the left.
Yes.
And Anthony's
yes,
on the
yes,
right.
Yes. So Roger has this wonderful red hair, and I'm on the right, and that's in Adam Smith's tomb. So yes, I mean, I've known Roger, or knew Roger, for nearly 40 years. As your picture showed, Roger received the Order of Merit in the Hungarian embassy in the 3rd of December 2019, so just before he died. He died in January this year.
Well, it's January.
Yeah, and this Hungarian award, which was actually given to him by Viktor Orban personally, who comes specially from Hungary to do this, followed similar awards from Poland and the Czech Republic. Of course, when Roger was active in the Czech Republic, that also included Slovakia. And Roger was very much influential in the dissident movements in those three countries. And he was honored by those countries for that. He was also, shortly before his death, knighted in Britain. So he was Sir Roger Scruton, which I never thought would happen because, as was said of Charles Péguy, Roger's activities, public activities, of which there were many and impressive, were always accompanied by the sound of breaking glass.
Dear.
However, he was honored, respected, revered, and appreciated in Central and Eastern Europe, and eventually in his own country. As you've already suggested, Ferdi, he was a polymath, and he was eminent in many fields other than philosophy, but I am going to talk about his philosophy, including musical composition. He wrote 2 operas and several songs. The music of Wagner, about which he wrote 3 important volumes. Novel writing, he wrote at least 6 novels, of which one I think is absolutely brilliant, called Notes from Underground, which is about what it was actually like in Prague in the 1980s. And myself, having been there in the 1980s, I know how true that was. It's a wonderful book. It's called Notes from Underground. He also, as you mentioned, wrote about country living and hunting, and also about wine, which he certainly knew a fair amount. But as Viktor Orban mentioned when he gave him his honor, Roger was a philosopher par excellence. And I think to some extent that aspect of his work, well, that was him, has been neglected in many of the tributes and appreciations that have followed his death. Now, Roger was, of course, English, and he'd been brought up in the Anglo-American analytical tradition, of which he was certainly highly regarded and expert. But he saw his work, his philosophical work, in what he called continental terms. The Anglo-American tradition stresses formal logic, quasi-scientific rigor, and overwhelmingly respect for natural science, and a desire, misplaced in my view, to ape its methods in philosophical work. And Roger, like me, we'd absorbed all this stuff. But Roger, and we didn't disparage it, or he didn't disparage it, but he saw philosophy as an unapologetic attempt to make sense of the world in those very areas which were regarded as less than central, less prestigious, marginal by the analytics. And these areas include aesthetics, music, religion, personal and sexual relations, the environment, lived and natural, and the nature of society and politics. And I'm going to try to say a little bit about each of these, Roger's contribution to each of these. However, if he saw himself as the continental in the range and nature of his philosophical interests, he repudiated the studied obscurity and, above all, the destructive and transgressive nature of the thought of leading continental philosophers such as Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, Badiou, and many others. And his sort of moment of conversion, or his moment of rejection of these trends, which of course some of them predated this, came in 1968 when he was in Paris in 1968, and he was horrified and disgusted by the hypocritical and bratish self-indulgence of the student radicals of 1968, who were simply doing dirt on the work that their parents had done and which allowed them to waft around the Sorbonne and so forth, tearing up cobblestones and throwing at the police and so on and so forth. So if Roger was philosophically a continental, he was a conservative continental with an analytically purified mind. Okay, so that's just a bit about his background, his style, and his range, and his general disposition. So we can call him a conservative continental. Now, fundamental to his thought was a distinction between the causes of things, what made things happen, which is what natural science is about, and Roger didn't disparage natural science at all. A distinction between the causes and the reasons why things happen. And this is a distinction which became crucial for him in looking at ourselves as human beings. So although we are creatures in a physical world, we're biological beings, analyzable in causal scientific terms, we are also persons whose activity is to be explained in terms of the reasons we have for what we do, and criticizable in terms of the values we have in what we do and how we act. In drawing this distinction between causes and reasons, Roger stood in the tradition of Kant, Immanuel Kant, who distinguished between the world as seen under scientific explanations, that's causation, and the moral, aesthetic, and religious understanding we bring to it, that's the reasons. Now, according to Kant, by whom Roger was influenced quite deeply, science presents us with a full description of the causes of what happens in the world. But as human beings, we are also subject to the demands of morality and open to the experience of beauty, in both of which areas we operate outside what is given to us in science. In Kant's own case, this was the science of Newton, in which every event that took place could be explained in deterministic terms. A radical take on the Kantian dichotomy is given by the young Wittgenstein in the Tractatus Logica Philosophicus, where he said that everything that can meaningfully be said can be said in the factual language of science. But, said Wittgenstein, everything of importance in our lives, ethics, art, and religion, lies outside what is sayable. So, a pretty striking claim by Wittgenstein. And of course, in the introduction to the Tractatus, he says how little has been achieved in doing this, because he has said that he's unable to talk about the things that really matter, ethics, art, and religion. More prosaically, but less self-defeatingly, and I think this is a helpful distinction, The American philosopher Wilfrid Sellars distinguished between the scientific image of the world, which is that which is presented in the theories of physics and the natural sciences, in which value and much of what we experience is abstracted away from, and the manifest image, the world in which we as persons live and move and have our being. And just to give one other landmark here, in 1962, Peter Strawson wrote an article, influential article called Freedom and Resentment, in which he showed, he was a British philosopher, English philosopher, showed how the categories of value, of praise and blame, of human agency in a general sense, are not accommodated in the value-free language of science, but nevertheless are indispensable and central to our lives, practically and morally. Now, Roger himself spoke in similar terms of a contrast between the world as revealed in science, the world of bloodless categories and mathematical laws, and what he called, following Husserl, the Lebenswelt, the lived world, the world of life. The Lebenswelt is the world of human experience, which he himself, Scruton himself, called the world of appearance, or the world as it seems. And I think actually he somewhere I seem to remember he quoted Oscar Wilde as saying, only a superficial man discounts the world of appearance, or something along those lines. Quite witty if you just think that through. Only a superficial man discounts the world of appearance. Anyway, Scruton was emphatic that in speaking of the Lebenswelt, he is not thinking that there is a world beyond that which is revealed in science. But while there's nothing beyond the boundaries which science draws, which I'll come on to later on, there are aspects of what is within the scientifically explicable world which science does not and cannot reveal. Primary among these aspects is the personal, everything to do with our lives as personal agents, free, valuing, praising, blaming, loving, hating, and so on, which none of that, of course, if you read a book of physics, you won't find anything about any of that. But that's, of course, what matters to us. Now, according to Scruton, this is a quotation, the personal, what I am, what I feel, praise, blame, guilt, etc., it's not an addition to the biological, it emerges from it in something like the way the face emerges from the colored patches on a canvas. And an example he's always giving here is, or always used to give, was the Mona Lisa. You can look at that painting, encased as it is in perspex in the Louvre, so you can just about still see it. But you can look at it either as a purely physical object, you know, a canvas with pigments on it, or you can see it as the face of La Gioconda. And both descriptions are true, but in a way they're irreducible to each other. But to go back to, but having emerged, either the personal or, in the case of the painting, what the painting is depicting, having emerged, we then have to deal with what has emerged, the personal, the painting, not the material substructure. We have to deal with it in terms appropriate to persons, which are not those of natural science. And here, Scruton followed in the footsteps of the later Wittgenstein, who in the philosophical investigations particularly, painstakingly showed that the terms in which we speak of our emotional, mental, and intellectual activity can be properly applied only to us as whole persons and not to our bodies or parts of our bodies. So, people think, calculate, are angry or in pain. Brains do not. Neurons underlie what we do and think and feel, but neurons do not think or reason or emote. They simply function according to whatever laws govern such bits of matter. As Leibniz said a long time ago, if you if you managed to blow up a brain so you could walk around it, you would see all this grey matter, whatever it is, but you would not see a thought. Now, most of the things that we correctly see people, ourselves and others as doing, we and they do because of our interaction with other people. So I'm now moving a bit beyond the person. Each person is already within a community of persons. Like Wittgenstein, Scruton repudiated the picture of a Cartesian soul thinking its thoughts in isolation in and by itself. We can have private thoughts and feelings, and we can have, and do of course have, an inner life, but we have it because we are already in a world of other people with a public language that we've learnt to think and act rationally and to exercise the most important of our mental capacities, even when we do so in private. In living with others, we learn to think and speak and have sophisticated emotions beyond mere animal reactions. So I'm saying, and Scruton would say, that there is something that in human activity, so animals are conscious, true, and he wrote well about that, but there are many things that human beings can do, capacities that we have, which are beyond mere animal reactions. In interacting with others, we develop a sense of our own identity and also of those of others as, like ourselves, endowed with personality and freedom. We see ourselves as accountable to them and them to us. So this is persons, not as bits of matter, not as biologically explicable things, above all, not as brains. It's a huge mistake, a mereological fallacy, a fallacy of place, to think that my thoughts are in my brain. They're not in my brain. In a sense, they're nowhere, and they happen because I am a person. I'm a person with a brain, but I'm much more than my brain. So most of neurophysiology is completely misconceived in that it's trying to locate things that are done by persons within the chemistry and neurology of the brain. But I'll leave that to one side now. Now, in living with others, we learn to think and speak and have sophisticated reactions beyond mere animal reactions. We develop a sense of our own identity and also of those others that we live with, like ourselves, endowed with personality and freedom. And we see ourselves as accountable to them and them to us. In growing up with others, we also inherit a human culture. So this connects with some of the things that have been said earlier, which enables us to see not just others as persons, but the world itself as endowed with a type of significance beyond what is given to us in the concepts and explanations of science. Now, in an evocative phrase, Roger himself said that through culture, we supply ourselves, our fellows, and our surroundings with a face. And he adds, if we do it right, we will see the face of our maker in the face that we make. We will see the face of our maker in the face that we make. I'm going to come back to that. But before I do, I want to fill out a bit with, this rather heady line of thinking, to take a brief look at what Roger said about aesthetics, which was the topic of his earliest philosophical work. And key to his ideas here is the notion of the imagination, whose role is to show what life means and how our hopes and fears reside in it. Now, it's easy to see how this notion, the imagination, works in the case of representational or verbal forms of art, such as painting, sculpture, literature, including poetry. And also why, in holding this view, Roger might have been attracted to articulating his philosophical views in novelistic form, which I've already mentioned. He wrote at least half a dozen, and he also wrote some Platonic dialogues. He wrote over 40 books of all different genres. We should note that this conception of art as infused by imagination not only immediately suggests a distinction between the content of a work of art, what it is showing, and its form, the adequacy or otherwise of the work to what it is attempting to show. And at both levels, this involves the critic in what might be called, broadly be called, morality. At least this is what Roger and I think, of course not just us. Is what the work is showing true? How often is that ever applied to, let's say, rap music or pop music, or the typical self-expressive novel? Is it worth showing? Does it succeed in what it attempts, and in what sort of way? Does it ennoble, or does it, in D.H. Lawrence's terms, do dirt on life? Or is it just boring, self-indulgent rambling? In this regard, Scruton is, of course, following in the footsteps of writers such as Ruskin, who has been mentioned, who obviously influenced Oscar Wilde in a strange way, and Leavis, F.R. Leavis, as he acknowledged. He found, Roger did, as they did, most of what passes for art as wanting in numerous respects, including the moral. Much of what we see today in art galleries is, in his words, he had a wonderful gift of a phrase, real junk, in quotation marks. Well, it is junk, but of course it's put in quotation marks in a gallery, and we all have to go and gawp at it and then read the lucubrations of the curator of interpretation as to what it actually means, this shit. And sometimes it is shit. No, it is. Yes, in the 1960s. Anyway, Roger admitted that his aesthetic theory is less easy to apply to the non-representational form of music. And here he argued that even without meaning anything expressible in words, in music, a form of agency is revealed. And I think this is deep, actually. We hear in music not just notes. Of course, we do hear notes, but actually we hear something quite other. Notes, just sounds. We don't just hear sounds. We hear music. We hear personality, feeling, and an attitude to the world. Pure and abstracted, it is true, from the contingent circumstances which give rise to such things. But we still hear a personality, Beethoven's personality. What's he telling us? Well, it's not telling us. What's he expressing? The nobility he's showing, the struggle, the humor, the tragedy, and so on and so forth. Like Plato and Nietzsche, though disagreeing with the latter over Wagner, Roger finds much music trash or worse. But in certain supreme instances, in what he calls, again his phrase, the meditative masterpieces of our tradition, a transcendental meaning. A you, the composer, as composer rather than empirical personality, summons an I, the listener, the attentive listener, something that, in an echo of the early Wittgenstein, is shown but cannot be said. And we can talk more about music later. But I now want to move on to another crucial aspect of Roger's thought, which was the insight that aesthetics should not be confined to the art we have to make a special effort to encounter. Architecture is an art whose creations all of us encounter every day. Not just the grand or grandiose ones, but the houses, shops, other buildings and townscapes in which we all pass most of our lives. Much of Scruton's most impassioned writing, both philosophical and journalistic, concerns itself with the importance of what might be called the everyday aesthetics of the environment. And here too, Ruskin stands as a forebear, though Roger loved the classical and the neoclassical in a way Ruskin never did. But what both objected to is an environment without charm, grace, comfort, livability, and the potential for the expression of individual taste, the very environment which has become de rigueur in the geometric, angular, concrete, blandly shadeless, and all too often graffiti-infected creations of modern architecture. Far from ornament being crime, as Adolf Loos averred, and far from form having to follow function, as contemporary dogma has it, for Scruton, ornament and form have their own intrinsic value, which makes both space and shelter livable, and which transforms a unit of habitation into a home. And I'll just mention here that in the last 18 months of his life, Roger put a huge effort into a government commission called Building Better, Building Beautiful. And this is the result of it, this long report called Living with Beauty. And this is particularly poignant because there's much of Roger in this beneath the bureaucratic presentation. There's a lot about planning laws and things like that in it. But as I say, he worked on this. He was the chairman of this commission for the last 18 months of his life when he was dying of cancer, and also had been vilified by a journalist from the New Statesman, as Ferdi has pointed out, as being racist, homophobic, and all kinds of other things. And he was sacked from the commission without even being asked if what was being claimed was true. It was not true. It was a misinterpretation, deliberate misinterpretation of a recorded interview, which fortunately we got the actual recording of the interview because it shows untrue. But he was sacked from this commission by the Prime Minister herself without even asking him. He only heard about it when he was coming back from Belgium on a train, that he had been sacked. And as I say, this all blew up when he was already quite ill, although he didn't know it was cancer at the time. Nevertheless, he was eventually reinstated and continued to work on the commission. And on the very day that he received the medal, the Order of Merit from the Hungarian Prime Minister, the morning of that day, he had been signing off, finishing the commission report, which I've just showed you. Anyway, home, to go back to his underlying thought, home, oikos, Greek, became a central concept for Roger in his later years, philosophically and practically. He saw human beings as first and foremost home seekers in what he used to call this vale of tears, very often. And he thought that as individuals, we seek what he called ontological rootedness, in the sense of depending on a person or persons and a place and a community for the ground of one's being. And to express this sense, he coined the term ecophilia, or oikophilia, depending on how you pronounce Greek, love of home, a concept which came to dominate his thinking both on the town but also on the country. And here he developed an approach to the environment which cherished the traditional and the natural against the depredations of industrial agriculture, urbanization of the countryside, and above all, plastic. Ecophilia, it should be stressed, does not imply xenophobia. One can love one's home without fearing or hating the foreign or the foreigner, as he conclusively demonstrated in his own life and person. I mean, he knew many languages, including Arabic and some Turkish, as well as, you know, all the normal European languages. But it will make one cautious, this ecophilia will make one cautious, as he was, of globalization and mass migration, where those phenomena uproot old identities and forms of belonging. And ecophilia connects neatly with his political philosophy. Indeed, it was at its heart, and it explains his disgust and anger at the 68ards, who were nothing if not ecophobes, soiling not just their own nests, but dishonouring and insulting those who had so generously provided them, their parents. Conservatism for Scruton was a matter of finding intrinsic value in the community in which one lives, ideally that in which one is brought up. Intrinsic value means valuing something because it is itself. We would not value another thing in the same way, even if it had exactly the same properties as the thing we love. So it's the thing in itself for what it is, but as that individual, and not something that's reproducible. For Scruton, England had intrinsic value for him and was the object of his attachment. He particularly valued the common law tradition in which customs, institutions, and freedoms have emerged gradually and peacefully through long experience, in contrast to attempts in other places and times to base a polity on abstract principles and formal legislation. Not, of course, that Britain in 2020 is immune from such tendencies. So even when we escape from the EU, we'll still be plagued with this type of thing. And while he valued the free market as the best way we know of producing and distributing goods, he was not an enthusiast for globalization and unrestricted free trade. At the same time, when we operate within a market, it is brought home forcibly that goods do not exist without work and effort. So, as with Adam Smith, the market teaches moral lessons. This basic reality about that moral lesson, that goods don't, as Nozick puts it, they're not manna from heaven, and neither are taxes, and neither is so-called government money, although Mrs. Thatcher always used to say the government has no money. This basic reality is ignored by most contemporary political philosophers, and also by the radicals of 1968, both of whom advocate state-organized redistribution in order to achieve equality of possession and status. For Roger, any such attempt ignored salient features of human existence, those which make each of us who, what, and where we are, including, of course, everybody's birth and upbringing, our own efforts and sense of responsibility, and would amount to a hubristic and ultimately unavailing crusade against contingency. Just have to accept contingency. And, you know, the way things pan out. Some people up, some people down. But this attempt to base politics on notions of equality, worse than all that, it makes envy and resentment the driving force of political endeavor, ignoring more important and more beneficent political aims such as personal security, defense against one's enemies, the transmission of culture in schools, including in Chavagnes, the treatment of those who are sick, and the cultivation in a society of the duties of honor, piety, and gratitude. All this talk of duty, piety, gratitude, honor, and so on, transmission of culture, personal security, all this talk of intrinsic value and of piety leads us naturally to religions. This is the last topic I'm going to deal with. And this topic in Roger's last years increasingly came to preoccupy him. The basic insight here is that human life, personal and social, requires for its flourishing a recognition that some things are sacred and that there are boundaries that may not be crossed. So he says that there can be such a thing as desecration, but what does desecration mean? It means de-sacredizing something. You can demean somebody. What does that mean? It means you take away their meaning. These suggest boundaries which should not be crossed. Hence, in matters of sex, Roger inveighed against pornography and promiscuity, which make of what should be treated with ultimate respect a matter of use and disposability. For him, the intrinsic value of the one I love means that they are not disposable or replaceable, but are loved for who, not what they are, mysterious as this may be metaphysically. it certainly suggests an attitude to human persons beyond the utilitarian or the purely biological. And in his book, Sexual Desire, quite an early book, he makes a lot of the biblical story of Leah and Rachel, when Jacob finds he's in bed with Leah, not with Rachel, and how that is so catastrophic for him, even though Leah is, of course, perfectly desirable. But it's Rachel is the one he loves. As I say, he makes very good use of that. In the Sexual Desire, it's a desire for this person, not for another person, even, even similar in all respects. Extending this sense of the other as intrinsically valuable beyond the realm of sexual relations into our dealings with others more generally, as we surely should, Scruton was led to speak of the world having an aspect or face other than that revealed in natural science. And he says, going a quotation, behind our daily negotiations, certain experiences cause this world to erupt through the veil of compromise and to make itself known. Now, his position here needs careful stating. In our interactions with others, in certain experiences of art, and in the sense of awe and maybe gratitude, which many of us experience before the existence of the world itself, we are taken out of the world of natural science with its complete accounts of the causes of things, and also out of any sense that other people and nature itself are to be seen as objects to be used and disposed of as we wish. In these experiences, things are, as Roger put it, rescued from the flow of time and made sacrosanct. It is in religious practice that this dimension of reality, the transcendent, out of the flow of time, made sacrosanct, it's in religious practice that this dimension of reality is made most explicit and articulate. But, and this is a big but, there is only one reality for Roger, which can be looked at either scientifically or religiously. This position he calls cognitive dualism. So it's about how I think, cognitive, and it's dualism, two things. So the one reality can be looked at scientifically or religiously. So we're back with the scientific image and the manifest image, with the manifest image now bearing moral, aesthetic, and religious meaning. But it's cognitive dualism, not ontological dualism. One reality to be perceived in two ways, each way necessary, but each way complete in itself. More than half a century ago, Eric Heller, a fine critic and writer, wrote of the sense of awe and wonder and almost religious mysticism evoked in the philosophy of Nietzsche and in the poetry of Rilke. And he called this sense that they evoke, he called it a religio intransitiva, an intransitive religion. Intransitive because in their work, I think he might be wrong about Rilke, but anyway, in their work, according to him, there was no being, no God, to which the cosmic feelings they evoked referred. Now, my feeling is that in Roger's cognitive dualism, if he's saying that, well, he does say that science gives a complete explanation of everything that happens in the world, and the other side of it, the manifest image side of it, is also complete. But if you see, we're physical beings in a physical world, and if the physical stuff can be completely explained in its own terms, where does that leave the manifest image? And going beyond that, I think that Roger says quite often that there is nothing beyond the physical world, although we can look at it in two ways. I think he is himself proclaiming a religio intransitiva, And I think that feeling is reinforced by one of the last sentences he published. In fact, I published it in the journal Philosophy in his lifetime. He said, "I have not, as I had hoped, found in cognitive dualism an escape route to the divine." So we look at the world as if it's divinely created. We look at it as a gift and look at it with awe, but that's all there is. Nevertheless, he doesn't say that this escape route, he doesn't say that the door is slammed shut. So I think I would like to develop his thinking in this area. And I had plenty of discussions with him on this point. He never slams the door completely shut. He says that he can't push it open, but maybe it can be pushed open. He would like it to be pushed open, but philosophically he can't. And I'll just mention one other thing, and this might be of interest particularly to Katerina. Before he died, Roger completed an opera libretto. So this is an opera that the music is being composed by our mutual friend, the composer, David Matthews. The opera was originally called An Angel Passes, but I gather it's actually going to be called Anna. And this is about some ex-dissidents in Prague, probably almost certainly in Prague, in, let's say, 1995. And these people who'd suffered and people had died under the communist regime now see freedom has come to Czechoslovakia, Slovakia too. By the way, Roger was quite generous about, he thought it was fine that Slovakia split off from Czech. But anyway, some of the main characters in this opera are horrified about what's happening in Prague in the 1990s, where the very same people who oppressed them as communists are now owning all the property and going into big business with godless foreigners, and how disgusting all this is. And the line I want to quote from the opera is, "When freedom came, God slipped away." And I will also just read a passage from Roger's own book to finish. His own book, which is called Our Church. And I did say to Roger, it might be your church, but it's not my church, because he's writing about the Anglican Church. But anyway, but this is a beautiful passage from it, which I think encapsulates some of his sort of area in which he was working with most feeling when he died. He said, "I know that there are many things that are entirely real and unquestionable, which lie beyond my capacity to explain them. That there is something rather than nothing, that there is self-consciousness, that I am free, that the world is law-governed and knowable. All these things are true, but inexplicable, since the understanding stops at their threshold, unable to rise to the transcendental perspective from which they might be fully grasped. The creation of something out of nothing is unintelligible to us, as is the nature of the person, with a big P, who can perform such a feat. Likewise, the appearance of that person among us is not something we can explain in words. It is a mystery of the same order as that of creation." I think he's talking about the incarnation there. Although those are things we do not understand, they correspond, nevertheless, to our religious intimations. We human beings are thrown down in this world without an explanation. The question, why am I, receives no answer from science or from the normal workings of rational argument. Yet it is an unavoidable byproduct of the moral life. It arises just as soon as we recognize that we are bound to each other and to the world by ties of responsibility, that we must account for our actions and that our lives are worthless until we learn to love and to give. We must therefore see the world as a whole in the terms that are thrust upon us by the moral life. We cannot escape guilt because we cannot escape judgment. The religious life is one lived in the full consciousness of judgment, and it requires a constant search for absolution, for the cleansing of the soul that comes when the fault is atoned for and forgiven. We can most easily accomplish this if we recognize that the world is a gift and our life part of that gift. We are called upon to give thanks, and the being whom we thank is the one who also grants absolution, since our faults are forms of ingratitude, failures to love. That is the meaning of the two commandments that Christ put above all others, on which hang all the law and the prophets. The Roman Catholic Church is right to regard penance as a sacrament. Penance is the work of restoration which renews and purifies the sinner by putting him once more in a relation of love. It requires the sinner to face up to his failings, to confess to them, to humble himself before God, and to make atonement. There are many things wrong with modern societies, but nothing more wrong, it seems to me, than the loss of this habit of repentance. All that is most gross and offensive in the world in which we live comes from the inability of people to live in judgment and to accept the need for remorse and atonement, and to accept that in begging forgiveness, they must also offer it. And Roger's last completed book, which again he was working on right up to the time of his death, is on Wagner's Parsifal, in which he argues that this shows us the centrality of forgiveness to the moral life. And Roger, despite his vilification by the journalist from the New Statesman, forgave him. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony.
So, my friend. I think we should have a drink. What?
Yes. Yes.
Can we have some questions? Is that possible?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, yes, yes. I might not be able to answer them.
I have two questions.
Yes.
The first perhaps is the more straightforward, I suppose. Do you feel that, or do you know that you yourself in any way influenced Scruton in any respect?
Well, difficult to say. I think I certainly prompted his interest in Simone Weil, and yeah, and who features, at least I thought, features prominently in Notes from Underground. Yes, and we talked a lot about some of these, well, religious questions and other questions. Yes, yes, and about beauty, indeed. Yeah, I don't know that I influenced him, but I certainly encouraged him, and I listened to him, and yeah, so I think it'd be fair to say that, you know, he didn't find many people who he could talk to philosophically who would be very sympathetic to him.
Really?
Well, there were some others, but yeah, so yeah, you know, I would say we were working in the same areas for a long time. That's one question. Yes.
Yes, and the other question had to do with his attitude to, or as you described it, to community and culture as to patriotism, let's say, in terms of our relationship to an inherited good with which we were intimately concerned, something which was an abiding value which we inherited, especially because of his connection to Central Europe, let's say to the Czech Republic.
well, Czechoslovakia as it was.
As it was, but I'm thinking specifically of let's say of Prague.
Yes.
Because I know Prague. I don't know Slovakia, but as you might know, I lived in Prague for much of the 1990s myself.
Yes.
And
you saw its materialization.
I did. Yeah. And I dare say it's rather worse now than it was in the 90s. I'm afraid. But for example, one of the things I noticed.
Yes.
One of the things I noticed, and there were a few friends I had, perhaps 2 or 3, who were aware of this, but it was generally something which wasn't spoken of and was something which only the very old knew anything about and had themselves more or less forgotten. That there had been a great sort of cultural washing away of the Jewish and Austro-Bohemian communities, which had been largely eradicated between 1939 and 1946.
Yeah, and the Germans, indeed.
I mean, when I say the Austro-Bohemians, I mean the German-speaking, the Germanic element. That's right.
Of course, Mahler came from Moravia.
Exactly.
Kafka wrote in German. I mean,
that's right.
Yeah.
And these were very, very distinctive Germanic people because they had some knowledge of Czech and Czech culture and the Czech language. Franz Werfel was another who was from Prague and so on. Yeah. And Rilke himself.
Wrote in German. Well, yeah, of course, he came from Prague. Yes.
That's right. Yeah. And most Czechs were oblivious to this. I mean, to the reality of it, to the fact that just a generation and a half before, this had been a very, very real part of the community, and now it was gone. It was completely gone. Even the street signs had been painted over. And just as I was leaving in '98, they began to sort of uncover some of the street signs and so on. The Jewish quarter was almost empty of Jews. There had been a few who'd returned, and so on. How would he have felt about the way about the let's say conservative attitude, this kind of removal from within a surviving community of those kinds of elements? Do you know whether he had any opinion about that?
Well, I think this is very difficult. And if I may be anecdotal, this time last year, just over a year ago, I went to a meeting of people from that part of Central Europe, but also including the Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, Poland, thank you, places I can't even remember now. Yes, and this was from the European Remembrance, Slovakia, Hungary, the European Remembrance Symposium it was called. And what I heard there particularly was lots of young people who were given 90 seconds to explain what they were doing about remembrance in their own country. And they were people who were making oral history recordings of what had happened in the 30s, 40s, 50s in that area of Central Europe. And what I didn't, I was completely stupidly ignorant. I did not realize how overlapping and how many, what should I say, ancestral hatreds and things there were in those areas, and how in the current mentality there is a kind of attempt to obliterate these memories. And I said, I did speak to the horror of 1 or 2 other English contributors to this meeting. I did talk about the virtues of home and of dwelling and of territory, because Roger bases his notion of ecophilia very much on territory. And I said, it's easy for me, even though I'm Irish by background, I'm part of the fallout of the Great Irish Famine, but never mind. It's easy for me from England, to talk about territory, without not having had the experience that people have had in Central Europe, and elsewhere. And I don't have an answer to this. I know that Roger, strangely enough, or perhaps not strangely enough, but he was actually, in some ways, an admirer of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as I think quite a lot of people are in that part of Europe now because of what's happened since.
Since, yeah. I experienced that among my Czech friends right at the end. That there
Yeah.
was a kind of, yes, sorry, go on.
No, but obviously, if you believe in, well, yes, I mean, but maybe homes can be shared. I mean, I don't know. I just think some of these things that Roger writes so evocatively about, you know, making perfect sense about England or Britain, it's more, I'm not saying they couldn't be applied, but they're more difficult to apply in places where these things have been shattered. But Roger, of course, would have never spoken to us like this. He would have loved Peggy.
Mm.
You know, with his evocation of the old, yes, the France, the Beauce, and, you know, the terre charnelle, very much.
Yes. Yeah.
But so my answer to your question is, this is something that needs very much to be developed or thought about. Yes. I'm ready. I don't know what's happening, but I can.
Well,
take another comment.
Yeah. Any more comments, questions? If anyone has a question or a comment, you'll need to switch your microphones on.
I'd just like to thank Anthony for that wonderful. It's impossible to put a life into such a small space, but you did a marvelous job of rounding up the best of his thought for this audience, and I just can't thank you enough. I've only read a handful of his books, and have a lifetime more reading to do because he was so prolific.
Yeah, he liked the United States, by the way, which was a nation built up. You know, just let's go back to Robert's question, built up of different ethnicities.
Yeah, and I'm very glad that you pointed out some influences from Russell Kirk and Wittgenstein there. So I really appreciated those threads and his thinking that you highlighted today. But anyway, thank you so much for that. That was just tremendous, tremendous treat.
Yeah.
Okay. Ferdi?
Well, if there's nothing else, then maybe we'll let people go their separate ways and say thank you very much to everybody who's participated today. And in response to Katerina's request earlier, if whatever people might send to me in writing, or maybe we might make a transcript of some things, for example, Joe's talk, we might make a transcript of that. We'll make those freely available for anybody who wants to look at them.
Okay, may I just say thank you so much, Ferdi, for this. I really didn't know what to expect, and I'm really, really thrilled to get to know all these people, from Roger Scruton, Arthur Rimbaud, and Oscar Wilde. I have to admit that at first I was fascinated because I saw there will be a lecture on Oscar Wilde, whom I very much like, but everything is so great. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Katerina. We hope to see you again, maybe in real life, and not just on the computer.
Yeah, and let's hope to see Chavagnes again in real life. I mean, I hope, and that, you know, that it continues this little nugget of a dynamic, continuing culture.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Well, absolutely.
Okay. Well, all the best to everyone. It's nice to see some regulars again. And we'll keep in touch, and God bless, and don't forget to wash your hands.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ferdi. Bye.
Thank you, Ferdi, for arranging. Yeah. Bye.
Bye. I'm not switching off. If anybody's going now, fine, but if you want to hang on for a couple of minutes and say anything else, then you can.
Yeah, I think so.
I enjoyed that very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have you had too much to smoke there, Robert?
No, this is number 2. Two pipe problem day, you know.
Yeah.
What about, so you living, Robert?
Well, I'm in Preston now, actually.
Really? Right, I
Yeah.
was born in Preston. So,
Were you?
yes.
Cheerio, Mike.
I wasn't born there. No, I was born in Aberdeen. My father was. We came to live in Preston quite early.
Mm. I moved here 2 years ago.
Yeah. Oh, it's probably it's the best of the old northern cotton towns. I think.
It's a fine place. I'm enjoying myself. Other than the rain, it's the second rainiest city in England.
Oh,
you-
it's perfect.
Aren't they imposing stricter rules on that part of the country at the moment?
Well, Blackburn is very bad, which is about 25 minutes away. And we're all going to be getting the stricter rules next week, I think.
Smith.
But at the moment, it's more or less the same as it was last week, which is to say, masks are obligatory on transportation again and in shops.
Right.
Otherwise, it's the same.
Mm.
So not too much just at the moment, but I think it's coming.
There's some fine pubs in Preston, or there were,
Just
and there's so many fine churches.
There are, yeah, there are.
The English Martyrs was where we used to go.
Yeah, well, there's a new school based in English Martyrs now that the Institute of Christ the King runs, and St. Walburg's is our parish.
Right. Okay.
So very happy here.
You probably know, maybe.
Sorry.
Peter Dilworth. He does.
Yes, I know Peter.
Yeah.
You know Peter.
His brother.
Sorry.
Oh, well, I was in the same junior school as
his brother. Ah.
Younger brother. We knew them. He was 2 years older.
He's a lovely guy, lovely fellow.
Yeah. Speaks wonderful Russian.
Yes, he does. He does. He lived in Russia a number of years.
Yeah.
He's a Burnley fan.
We'd better say goodbye, otherwise nobody will they'll feel it's disloyal to leave. So, if you don't object, I'm going to end the meeting now. Any objections?
Bye, Ferdi.
Bye, Ferdi.
Wave. I'm going to press the button now.
I
can
object.
switch you off any second now. 1, 2, 3, and oh, I can't find the buttons. Here we go. End meeting for all. You're about to go.